Hello and welcome back to Talking Europe. Today's guest is Ukrainian author Andrei Kurkov, who has been observing Ukrainian society for the past quarter century, and today is going to help us better understand what place Europe has for this country at the crossroads between the West and Russia. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, you've written over 20 novels during your career. They've been translated into almost 40 languages. Perhaps the best known of those is Death and the Penguin, a satire on the absurdities of life in post-communist Ukraine. But now you're here because we've got the French translation of your latest novel, Vilnius, Paris and Londres. And this is actually your first book which is set outside of Ukraine, correct?
Yes.
And it follows three Lithuanian couples as they leave the country on the cusp of the country joining the Schengen zone of free movement in the EU. They disperse across Europe. Why did you want to place the Schengen zone as kind of a major character in your novel?
Well, if I would have named the book a European story, it would be too general. And of course, I mean, I'm taken as a point of departure 20th December of 2007, when Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia joined Schengen zone, while being already members of EU. So it was like the door was finally open, and lots of Lithuanians, and Lithuania already lost 25% of population due to immigration. And so once the borders disappeared between Poland and Lithuania, it was like open door and invitation for the younger people again to go to Western Europe. So I wanted to talk about small nations dissolving themselves in this great European cultural and social space. So it's about Lithuania, but it's also about Europe, about whether it is possible to be one space with one culture, or is it one space with many cultures, many traditions, many different political attitudes?
Okay, you mentioned that kind of the dissolving of the nation state into the greater European state. The end of the borders and the Schengen zone is very much a foundation of the EU project. However, that all sounds well and good when it's on paper, but for your characters, it's a bit more complicated than that. They do have quite a lot of trials to get throughout the novel. What contrast do you see between those European objectives and what occurs on an individual level?
Well, first of all, many people, I mean, like many young Lithuanians, they thought that actually that Europe is just big Lithuania. So, I mean, they were not prepared to this diversity European. I think if you want to become a EU European or Schengen European, you have to be educated. You have to understand what is Europe, what is it made of. Also for Ukrainian, I mean, this is a big question, because those who work in Poland, they think that actually Europe is Poland. So when they go from Poland to Germany, they are surprised by the difference. They're surprised by the law-abiding Germans and the rules they find there. So, I mean, you have to be not only cosmopolitan to enjoy this common space. You have to know a lot of things about Europe, and even better to know European history. Not very deep, but at least from the times of the First World War.
You yourself, as an individual, you're a globe-trotting intellectual, very cosmopolitan, as you mentioned earlier. That is at the heart of these contrasts in Europe. Can that open cosmopolitan model for Europe survive the current waves of populism, which are very much the other current that is dominating the issues in Europe?
Well, this is the biggest issue, because actually populism very easily turns into nationalism or promotion of nationalism, radical nationalism. And then actually Hungarians or Poles or somebody else start saying that we don't want all these foreigners here, not only refugees and migrants, but also, I mean, foreigners from neighboring countries. In fact, actually, it looks like almost natural movement of people from the east to the west, because when 1 million Poles went to Britain and became the best plumbers there, 1 million Ukrainians came to Poland to replace them. And so far, not many other nations came to Ukraine to replace Ukrainians who left. But I think the same sort of scheme or the same situation is happening with Lithuania. Lithuanians are coming to the places which were abandoned by somebody else who went to Canada or to America. And this is almost natural process in Europe. The main thing is that there should be forces and politics to support tolerance, European tolerance, and to support this idea of multicultural multi-language Europe.
This book, moving on from this book, this is your first book that was been written about something other than Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, there is no Ukraine and no Ukrainians in this book.
All your other novels are very much about Ukraine, including Dispatches from Kiev, which was a front row perspective, your diaries during the Maidan revolution of 2013-2014. Almost 5 years have passed since then. How do you judge the sacrifice of that uprising? Was it worth it?
I think it was worth it. But of course, I mean, Ukrainians are very impatient. They wanted to change the country overnight, which never happens. But I think in 5 years, Ukraine, in spite of the war in the east, achieved a lot of progress. I mean, we have now reformed police. We have difficult but going reforms of the legal system, of the medical services. And first of all, the army is restored to function in state, because Yanukovych, who left the country in 2014, actually he managed almost to destroy the Ukrainian army. So when actually the war started, the Ukrainian army was unable to respond. And so the volunteers went to the front lines to defend Ukrainian sovereignty.
That paints a pretty positive picture of the situation in Ukraine.
Well,
it's still riven by a great deal of corruption. There's the rise of nationalism.
I mean, of course, I mean, every Ukrainian wants to talk about positive things. There are lots of problems. There are problems with populism, with corruption, because it's very difficult to fight with corruption when corruption became almost traditional from 1991. But I mean, there are changes, but they are moving slower than one wants them to move.
And can those problems be surmounted by the positive willpower of the citizens in Kiev and further afield?
Well, I think they can be solved. They can be conquered, these problems. And especially, I mean, the main thing is that the young generation doesn't want to live according to the old rules. So, I mean, the young people, the young businessmen, when they are demanded bribes, they go to secret services or to the police. They don't give money to the functionaries who want not to give them some kind of paper needed for free according to the law.
Now, the annexation of Crimea by Russia was a major milestone in the conflict in 2014, and for many residents, life has far from improved. 4,000 people were evacuated from their homes in August following an industrial chemical leak in northern Crimea. This report by Gulliver Craig takes a look at how Crimea's isolation from Ukraine continues to penalise citizens.
Autumn came early to Armyansk this year. It wasn't the weather that turned the leaves brown, but a massive release of toxic gas, apparently from a titanium dioxide factory 10 kilometers to the north. It wasn't until 2 weeks after the toxic cloud appeared that the authorities finally moved to evacuate the town's children. The mayor is playing down the problem. Telizhenko says the problem has arisen because the factory's acid reservoir is too dry. He blames Ukraine.
They closed the North Crimean Canal, so there was not enough water. Actually, it would be possible to fill the acid reservoir even without opening the canal, but this would require the Ukrainians to fill up the artificial lakes, which are located on their side.
Until recently, the peninsula got 85% of its water from the Dnieper River in mainland Ukraine via the North Crimean Canal. But when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the canal was blocked. The specialists reject the idea that the lack of water is to blame.
We think there was a one-off discharge, which would suggest that the factory has not been respecting proper procedures, or that there was some accident that they're not telling us about.
Kiev sees the canal as a reminder of Crimea's integration with Ukraine and refuses to supply water for as long as Russia is illegally occupying the territory.
What we're seeing here is a very stupid, poorly thought-out attempt by Russian propaganda to exploit this ecological and humanitarian situation to have another go at persuading us to send water down the canal. Though there are plenty of ways to reduce chemical pollution, the simplest one being to simply close these factories.
Crimea's de facto authorities seem to be torn between blaming Ukraine and saying the problem's been solved. Since this report was filmed, residents of Armyansk have complained of another wave of toxic pollution. Those who can are leaving town.
Now, Crimea, of course, was a very major symbol of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president's aggressive land grab back in 2014, really taking the territory forcibly from Ukraine. Have you any optimism, any hope that relations between Ukraine and Moscow can ever improve?
Well, as Mr. Putin says that he will not talk to President Poroshenko, but might talk to another president who will be more likely to agree to the Russian demands. The same I can say about Putin. Until Mr. Putin is gone, there will be no changes and no improvement in the Russian-Ukrainian relations.
Your works are banned in Russia, even though you write in Russian itself. Ukrainian filmmaker Oleg Sentsov was imprisoned and is still imprisoned on terrorism charges in Russia. Why do you think Vladimir Putin is so scared of cultural critics? Why do you think he thinks you threaten his power?
I think he wants to keep people, Ukrainians, actually pro-Ukrainian people, in jail, actually to show how strong he is. And he doesn't want to show his weakness by releasing them. The other thing is that Oleg Sentsov, who is also a writer who writes in Russian novels and short stories, he has nowhere to go, because if he is released, his motherland is Crimea. He cannot go there. He will go to Ukraine, but he is not the only prisoner, political prisoner from Ukraine, kidnapped and put in the Russian jails. There are dozens of them. Alexander Kolchenko, another, his friend from Crimea, Roman Sushchenko, the Ukrainian journalist who worked in Paris and was arrested in Moscow. So I think he is keeping them also as bargaining chips. And there was a leak, I think, from Russian secret services that Russia would be prepared to exchange Ukrainian prisoners with Americans for the Russian spies held in American jails.
And do you get the impression that the European Union, having been held a firm line back at the start of the crisis 4 years ago, do you think that they've succeeded in holding that firm line, or do you think they've rather wavered a bit too much over the past few years?
Well, there is a danger that some countries will try to persuade European Union to ease the sanctions and to restart the trade, because economy sometimes for some countries is more important than democracy and human rights. But I hope actually European Union will remain firm on the sanctions, because without the sanctions, actually the situation will deteriorate.
Well, you mentioned there the changing line in the European Union, but we've got an increasing number of Western leaders, be they Donald Trump on the other side of the Atlantic, but here in the EU too, from Italy, from Viktor Orban in Hungary, which are very much striking a line that's aligning themselves with Vladimir Putin. Does that give you a cause for concern that perhaps Ukraine's going to be forgotten?
Well, I hope it won't be forgotten, but it is a serious reason for concerns. And of course, I mean, if you count how many times Putin met with Orban during the last 4 years, you will be surprised. You would think that actually Hungary is a country of size of America, so important. But because he is prepared to meet everybody who is pro-Russian and who is against European Union. So in this sense, they have similar ideas. Hungary doesn't want European Union to rule all the Europe, including Hungary. And Russia doesn't need European Union because as a unity of European countries, European Union is very strong in their political movements, political messages, including the sanctions against Russia for the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass.
The presidential elections are due next year in Ukraine. How do you judge the 4 years in power of President Petro Poroshenko? He came to power in the middle of a crisis. Has he been able to succeed?
Well, he managed to do much more than previous presidents did. He restored the Ukrainian army. He managed to push ahead the police reform, legal reform, medical reform. He is slow on the fight against corruption, but it is not easy because the corruption in Ukraine has very long history and was actually nourished by the previous presidents who were just pushing towards the budget money, all their friends and cronies, yeah. But generally, I'm more pro-Poroshenko than pro-anybody else. The main competitor of Poroshenko is Tymoshenko, and I have fear that if she comes to power, she will probably find a common language with Russia. And actually, the representative of Russian politics, they said already they will be happy to talk to Tymoshenko about how to end the war.
One final question, and returning to the question of the war. And your next novel is, I believe, going to be about the Donbass region in the east of Ukraine, which is very much at the heart of the conflict. It's an incredibly bitter conflict, which no real political resolution has been found. What are you hoping to show with your novel?
Well, I wanted actually to show the mentality of people who live in Donbass and who live in Crimea and who lived there for all these 27 years without feeling the country like almost isolated, but at the same time under the umbrella of Russian information, Russian culture, not Ukrainian culture. So they had a problem of identity, and they were at the same time the bearers of the Soviet mentality, collective mentality, which remained there from the times of great industrial region of Donbass. The novel is about gray zone, about the villages with thousands of people who lived between the positions of the separatist army and Russian army and positions of Ukrainian army, which means they're not governed by neither of the sides.
Okay, that sounds fascinating, and I look forward to seeing it realized. Thank you very much, Andrei Kurkov, for taking the time to speak to us here at France 24. That's the end of this edition of Talking Europe. Do stay tuned for more news and headlines after this short break.
I'm Natalie Savarikas, and you'll usually find me in news, reporting on Greece's enduring financial turmoil and protests, but also the refugee emergency, here on France 24.
Natalie Savarikas, one of the 200 France 24 correspondents around the world.